A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett, as read by Eastgate Audio. Chapter 19. Anne. Never had such joy reigned in the nursery of the Large family. Never had they dreamed of such delights as resulted from an intimate acquaintance with the little girl who was not a beggar. The mere fact of her sufferings and adventures made her a priceless possession. Everybody wanted to be told over and over again the things which had happened to her. When one was sitting by a warm fire in a big glowing room, it was quite delightful to hear how cold it could be in an attic. It must be admitted that the attic was rather delighted in, and that its coldness and barrenness quite sank into insignificance when Melchizedek was remembered, and one heard about the sparrows and things one could see if one climbed on the table and stuck one's head and shoulders out of the skylight. Of course, the thing loved best was the story of the banquet and the dream which was true. Sarah told it for the first time the day after she had been found. Several members of the Large family came to take tea with her, and as they sat or curled up on the hearthrug, she told the story in her own way, and the Indian gentleman listened and watched her. When she had finished, she looked up at him and put her hand on his knee. "That is my part," she said. "Now won't you tell your part of it, Uncle Tom?" He had asked her to call him always Uncle Tom. "I don't know your part yet, and it must be beautiful." So he told them how, when he sat alone, ill and dull and irritable, Ram Das had tried to distract him by describing the passers-by, and there was one child who passed oftener than anyone else. He had begun to be interested in her, partly perhaps because he was thinking a great deal of a little girl, and partly because Ram Das had been able to relate the incident of his visit to the attic in chase of the monkey. He had described its cheerless look and the bearing of the child, who seemed as if she was not the class of those who were treated as drudges and servants. Bit by bit, Ram Das had made discoveries concerning the wretchedness of her life. He had found out how easy a matter it was to climb across the few yards of roof to the skylight, and this fact had been the beginning of all that had followed. "Sab," he had said one day, "I could cross the slates and make the child a fire when she is out on some errand. When she is returned, wet and cold, to find it blazing, she would think a magician has done it." The idea had been so fanciful that Mr. Carrisford's sad face had lighted with a smile, and Ram Das had been so filled with rapture that he had enlarged upon it and explained to his master how simple it would be to accomplish numbers of other things. He had shown a childlike pleasure and invention, and the preparations for carrying out the plan had filled many a day with interest which would otherwise have dragged wearily. On the night of the frustrated banquet, Ram Das had kept watch, all his packages being in readiness in the attic, which was his own, and the person who was to help him had waited with him, as interested as himself in the odd adventure. Ram Das had been lying flat upon the slates, looking in at the skylight, when the banquet had come to its disastrous conclusion. He had been sure of the profoundness of Sarah's wearied sleep, and then, with a dark lantern, he had crept into the room while his companion remained outside and handed the things to him. When Sarah had stirred ever so faintly, Ram Das had closed the lantern slide and lain flat upon the floor. These and many other exciting things the children had found out by asking 1,000 questions. "I am so glad," Sarah said. "I am so glad it was you who were my friend." There were never such friends as these two became. Somehow, they seemed to suit each other in a wonderful way. The Indian gentleman had never had a companion he liked quite as much as he liked Sarah. He was always amused and interested, and he began to find an actual pleasure in the possession of the wealth he had imagined that he loathed the burden of. There were so many charming things to plan for Sarah. There was a little joke between them that he was a magician, and it was one of his pleasures to invent things to surprise her. She found beautiful new flowers growing in her room, whimsical little gifts tucked under pillows, and once, as they sat together in the evening, they heard the scratch of a heavy paw on the door, and when Sarah went to find out what it was, there stood a great dog, a splendid Russian boarhound with a grand silver and gold collar bearing an inscription. "I am Boris," it read. "I serve the Princess Sarah." There was nothing the Indian gentleman loved more than the recollection of the little princess in rags and tatters. The afternoons in which the Large family or Ermengarde and Lottie gathered to rejoice together were very delightful. But the hours when Sarah and the Indian gentleman sat alone and read or talked had a special charm of their own. During their passing, many interesting things occurred. One evening, Mr. Carrisford, looking up from his book, noticed that his companion had not stirred for some time, but sat gazing into the fire. "What are you supposing, Sarah?" he asked. Sarah looked up with a bright color on her cheek. "I was supposing," she said. "I was remembering that hungry day, and a child I saw." "But there were a great many hungry days," said the Indian gentleman with rather a sad tone in his voice. "Which hungry day was it?" "I forgot you didn't know," said Sarah. "It was the day the dream came true." Then she told him the story of the bun shop, and the fourpence she picked up out of the sloppy mud, and the child who was hungrier than herself. She told it quite simply, and in as few words as possible, but somehow the Indian gentleman found it necessary to shade his eyes with his hand and look down at the carpet. "And I was supposing a kind of plan," she said when she had finished. "I was thinking I should like to do something." "What was it?" said Mr. Carrisford in a low tone. "You may do anything you like to do, Princess." "I was wondering," rather hesitated Sarah. You say I have so much money. I was wondering if I could go see the bun woman and tell her that if, when hungry children, particularly on those dreadful days, come